Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Catherine Salmon, Professor of Psychology at the University of Redlands. We spoke about a whole range of things, sibling conflict, anorexia, and evolutionary explanations for it, how female puberty timing is affected by father absence. And then in the extended part of the episode, we spoke about male and female porn preferences. So women's interest in romantic fiction, what that tells us about female sexuality, male interest in visual porn, what that tells us about male sexuality. Be warned that the last 20 minutes is super not safe for work or safe for young ears. So just be cautioned about that. That's the last 20 minutes of the extended episode, which is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the MMM chat community, and also the bonus episodes that I record with my husband. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Okay, Catherine, before we get on to the really X-rated stuff, which I'm sure we will, should we start with the less X-rated stuff and talk about some of your work on siblings and sibling conflict? What are the advantages of being a middle child? Let's start there.
Well, I think there are lots, although most people don't think about that as being something that's advantageous. But one of the things that people often think of as a challenge, but actually I think in the end turns out to teaching really good skills for middle children, is that they are sort of stuck in the middle, right? They have siblings, there's competition for resources, there's competition to get what you want, there's competition just managing things in your own household. One of the things that teaches them is really good negotiating skills, because they're not in a power position at the top, but they're also not in the baby go running to parents position at the bottom. And so they really learn good negotiating skills. They learn how to get along with other people, but yet still get what they want, right? So it's the kind of thing that makes for good negotiating skills, good business skills. I think that's one of the benefits of being born in the middle spot. I think another one that's a really big one is that middle children don't have the same pressures on them often that firstborn children do, right? Because they're a little bit freer to find out what they want to be and what they want to do without the pressures that are often put on firstborn children. It's like, you must follow in daddy's footsteps, or you must do this, or you must do that. Things get a little bit more lax as kids, as you get more and more children in the family. And I think that also benefits middle children, although it can take them a while to figure out what they want to do.
Talk to me more about sibling conflict in general. So what are the sort of factors that aggravate sibling conflict?
Yeah, the things that tend to make sibling conflict, I think, more problematic: close birth spacing, right? So if you have a sibling that's just a year, maybe 2 years older or younger than you, a lot more conflict, because you want the same things at the same time. You want the same kind of attention. If you're 10 years old and your sibling's 16 years old, well, there's a lot less conflict, because you're not in the same social groups, you're not wanting the same things at home. Everything's different. You're not arguing over the same things. It's not fighting over who gets the car, right? Those are very different when you have wide birth spacings. I think in general, sibling conflict is more extreme when children are closer together in age, at least when they're younger. They may be closer when they're older, but when they're younger, it tends to make things more tight. If you're same sex, again, competitive over the same sorts of things, right? You want the same things. You often maybe competing to be the best at the same sports or other kinds of activities. And so in general, close birth spacing, same sex, low resources in the family in general. right? Having more kids or having less economic resources, those are the things that tend to increase levels of conflict.
And what's the evolutionary explanation for that?
Largely, it's just that, you would expect in some ways to have less conflict between siblings than unrelated people, right? And we do, because you have shared genetic interests, right? And often siblings can be incredibly solidary, and you often see that sometimes when they're younger, and you see that sometimes when they're older, right? Where families work together to do things. But despite that, right, parental resources are sometimes limited, family resources can sometimes be limited. And so when resources are tight, and you have a lot of children in the family, you tend to have more competition for resources. Also, sometimes if you have a lot of unrelated children in the family, right, like stepchildren, that can increase levels of conflict in a way that it doesn't necessarily if you still have some genetic relatedness, like having half siblings and full siblings living in the same household.
Do we see that straightforwardly, that the unrelated, so adoptive or step
Well, so
children?
the step are different from the adopted. So in most
Okay.
studies, the adopted look like the biologicals. Like that's how it plays out. And it's typically because so many adopted are adopted as babies, right? They're raised in the family. They're treated really as if they were a biological child in the family. And so you don't see those as much. But we don't have great data on that because it's difficult to recruit those populations sometimes into studies. And so I think there are a lot of us, I would love to have more adopted kids in my sibling studies because I think it would be really useful to get that information. And I myself am interested because I was also adopted as a baby. And so it's a personally interesting question to me. But in general, what we see if we're looking just at conflict is that there's higher levels of conflict actually between full biologically related siblings, and then also the step ones, and then actually a little bit less with the half siblings, the ones that actually are partially related but not fully related. And that might be, I mean, we wondered about why that would be because it's not the strict evolutionary prediction, right? The strict evolutionary prediction is the more related, the less conflict you should have. But what we think may be going on with some half siblings is that they're getting a lot of investment from the parent that is not in the home that they're living in, right? So if they're living with mom and they have a stepdad and a dad outside the home that's biological, that biological dad is also often contributing. Sometimes they're not in the home as much, they're splitting their time between them. And so it may be reducing sources of tension.
Because there are more resources to go
Yeah.
around. Is that it? Okay, right. Are there advantages, thinking about big families? Because I hear this from friends who grew up in big families who have lots of children, that they're, like a friend of mine likes to tell a story about how his cousins, he has like loads and loads of cousins because they're from some traditional Catholic family. And it's a very sort of loud and quite sort of a household prone to conflict. But when those kids go into
Yep.
school, there is no way a single one of them is being bullied
Right.
because there are so many siblings within the school that they have this kind of posse. They protect each other and they have this incredible level of sort of social confidence as a consequence. So is that a trade-off that you see in the big families?
I think it can be a trade off, but I also think it is one of those benefits of larger families. It's one of those benefits of siblings in general. Like if you have siblings or if you have extended family, right, like cousins, your social allies, right? And you have bonds of affection, you have bonds of obligation. And so there is a tendency for older and larger siblings and cousins to be protective for the younger ones in the family. And I think that family size, individual family size can help with that if you have lots of siblings. But I also think, as you say, the extended family, right? If you live close to your extended family, if your parents have lots of brothers and sisters and you all live close, then you can have these really large cousin networks. I also have one of those large cousin networks because I also came from a family that had a Catholic side to it and had lots of children. And so, there are, like probably 6 cousins that are all within a year or two of my age, right? And it gives you a certain kind of social group growing up that you might not have otherwise. The current trend towards having singletons puts a lot of pressure on the family to help that child develop those social skills to then make those bonds outside the family at a very early
Yeah,
age.
what do you see in terms of because yeah, as you say, singleton is an increasingly common family structure. What are I know the stereotypes about only children. Is it borne out in the data?
Well, some of them are. So they do tend to be, in some ways, they're kind of like firstborns that don't have to do some of the tasks that firstborns do in terms of dealing with their younger siblings, right? So firstborns often do a bit of pseudo parenting. They're the protectors sometimes they're the babysitters, right? Onlys are a lot like firsts in that parents put a lot of pressure on them, right? If you have one egg in the basket, you put a lot of pressure on that baby. You invest a lot in them, you spend a lot of time with them. But some children don't deal well with that level of pressure. And so I think that there are some negatives to that if parents aren't careful with their onlys, that they actually stress them out and make them more anxious because they don't have, a fallback of siblings necessarily to rely on, but also because parents put so much value on what that child achieves. And that's a lot to put on smaller children.
You will often hear now the critique of modern parenting that it's very helicoptery and involves a lot of risk aversion and sort of hyper focus on children's activities and so on. And I've heard more than once people suggesting that this is one of the things that's suppressing birth rates because you just can't sustain that level of attention across more than one or two children. But I've often thought it's more likely to be the other way around. It's more likely to be that if you're putting all your genetic eggs in one basket or in two baskets, maybe, you are going to be more risk averse. You're going to be more unconsciously, of course. No one wants their children to die, no matter how many they have. But if you've only got the one, surely that is going to aggravate parental anxieties and encourage helicopter parenting.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I have not seen a ton of studies looking at that sort of thing, like looking at levels of parental anxiety and helicoptering on the basis of the number of children that they have. But certainly the studies that have looked at differences between children based on how many children there are in the family, which suggests that the children themselves are internalizing some of that, right? That they're less independent than they are if they have a whole bunch of kids, because you just let them all go out and play together, right? Instead of having a lot of their play be supervised by the parent, be supervised by other parents, being very controlled, right? So the people who've argued for more the free range children kind of argument are really arguing for letting children have the opportunity to make mistakes in a way that the mistakes are not going to be damaging to them, but it's going to give them that confidence to go out and be independent. And I think when we see, so for example, at the college level, right, students who have difficulty even choosing which classes they want to take and want their advisors to help them choose everything are ones that are used to their parents making all those decisions for them. And I think that that's probably detrimental in the long run because, again, they're not independent and they're not going to have their parents to run their lives forever.
Anorexia. So I know you've looked into this. There is variation in how much in incidences of anorexia that we see cross culturally, and indeed all sorts of other indications of mental distress that we see cross culturally. The stereotype of the anorexic is the golden girl. I've read that anorexics have like quite significantly higher IQs than the average population. That the population we're talking about is often very well. They have to have a very high level of self control. What do you think's going on with that?
I studied eating disordered behavior in a couple different ways over quite a big span of time. So I did some work almost 20, actually, it was be 20 years ago. And then I did some work just, maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I published that was looking at this. And, originally a lot of what I was focused on was what kinds of stressors might make this more or less problematic. The things that we found to be most problematic were mainly things surrounding female competition, right? High levels of female competition. It didn't really matter what the female competition was about. I mean, a lot of it was about looks and status and boyfriends and whatever. It's just high levels of teenage girl kind of competition. And we actually did look at some of the things like the media effects at that time. Now, that was pre the rise of the current sort of level of things with Instagram and Snapchat and things like that. And we didn't find a big effect for that. But we did find a really big effect for people's self-perception of how much competition that was happening between girls, which kind of explains the early data showing really high levels of eating disorders in like girls' boarding schools and things like that, where there aren't even any guys around, but the girls are all competing with each other within their own social group. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we were looking at it like very much as a female intersexual competition thing. and this idea that it suppresses reproduction, right? And if you can suppress other women's reproduction and make them less attractive to the opposite sex, that might be a very effective tactic in terms of the way women respond to other, women, in terms of engaging in behaviors that may be damaging to individuals in terms of their fertility.
Wait, sorry. So it would be in my evolutionary interests to encourage my female competitor to become anorexic because then she would stop.
Yeah, that could be part of it, right? That could be part of it, and part of it could be the sort of more traditional perspective of looking at it, which is just if it's not a good time to reproduce, you should suppress your reproduction, right? Which is the sort of animal model that a lot of people have also looked at, in terms of eating disorder behavior, which is, it ties in a lot to the physiology, right? If your body fat drops too low, then reproduction ceases. And in times of famine, that would have been a useful strategy. I don't, the fact that it happens so often and more often in highly developed countries and societies where we have an over access to food suggests that it's not so much about that aspect of things. It's about other social factors that are making your reproductive competition and your reproductive activities perhaps undesirable. And it's some of it may be competition between women where women are actively suppressing other women by their actions, or it may be just that the women themselves are perceiving the environment as being less positive and so are engaging in this behavior that then suppresses it. A lot of the work that we did was just looking at what kinds of factors might influence um, that kind of thing, and then how are those things playing out in the modern environment. And I think that sort of speaks to some of the differences cross culturally, right, where women are expected to actually not really be focusing a lot on reproduction in terms of baby making, but are supposed to be taking on a very masculine role, then reproduction is not necessarily a positive thing. And so women might self suppress under those environmental conditions.
Oh, that's interesting. So anorexia might be more of a feature in a sort of low fertility society, which is more focused on female masculine achievement.
Or at least taking on a more masculine typical role societally, right? So that the majority of work is outside the home in more traditionally masculine environment rather than working from home, taking care of kids, things like that. Right? If you look at like those differences between traditional and non-traditional societies, you see these big differences in disordered eating behavior amongst high achieving women, which might speak to your IQ issue. I have not actually ever measured that in any of the studies that I've done looking at eating disordered behavior, but it might make sense that those women may be pursuing those strategies in the modern environment, and that may be increasing that challenge for them, right?
I know you said that media didn't seem to make that big a difference in your studies, which was pre-social media. But it is socially contagious, right? I mean or that's the impression I get, that
Yeah,
it
I
has a
mean,
kind of mimetic energy.
yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that. There's actually and it's not looking at eating disorder behavior. I think it's looking at social media more broadly. So a recent meta-analysis just in the process of coming out, I think it was just accepted by, I think, Chris Ferguson, looking at the effects of social media and showing that they're not as strong as we necessarily think they are. I do think that peer stuff, period, is always an issue, right? Because when we think about the idea that if this is about competition between women, then the women in your own environment are the ones who are going to be influencing you. Now, for most of our history, that would have been the girls in our social group, right? Like the girls in the gang. It'll be the girls in the social group. I think the relevance of social media may be in how susceptible people are to internalizing that social media as part of their social group, right? And again, that's the argument for why it should matter. I'm not sure that the data is as clear cut that it does as we often assume it should be, but I think the possibility is there that it could be. I mean, people learn information from the environment around them, right? If they're taking it in from that environment as well as their local environment, I think that um, says that it probably is having some sort of effect. Whether it's the majority effect moving it, I don't know, because we had problems with this long before social media as well.
So you sometimes read about cases historically of so-called holy anorexics, so women who manifest anorexia like symptoms, I suppose, but say in medieval Europe, and they do it for their justification for it is religious and to do with fasting rather than the way that we rather than more contemporary understandings of it. Do you think it's the same phenomenon that we're seeing, just sort of expressed in different cultural contexts, or do you think there's reason to believe that those holy anorexics have nothing to do with modern
Yeah,
anorexics?
I think it's really hard to know, right? I mean, I think it's really hard to know. For me, I want to know a lot more detail about their own personal sort of history in every single one of those case studies, because the question is like, if they're doing it for religious reasons, are they somebody who's already sacrificed their reproductive existence to that? Is it something that brings them status within their community, right? I mean, and presumably that sort of thing can, and so could have that kind of an effect. One of the things about this, though, too, that I wanted to address, because I think you mentioned at the very beginning, was this issue about self control. So one of the more recent studies that I did in collaboration with AJ Figueiredo and one of his students, we actually measured executive function, which is supposed to be a measure of that, and it was actually lower in people that had more disordered eating behavior. And so again, it was like, well, I mean, you clearly have to have enough self control to not eat, but you also are not self controlled enough to eat properly. See what I mean? Like it's like an exaggeration. So people who have to take it to the extreme, either I'm going to eat very little or I'm going to eat very much. It's still a failure of proper regulation, I guess, in a sense. And so I think it's an interesting question about what's really going on with their ability to exercise appropriate levels of control over their behavior.
I've heard some people who've had eating disorders say that being very, very hungry sometimes has a kind of psychological high or physiological high. Actually, it can be actually quite addictive, that feeling of extreme hunger.
Like a runner's
I
high.
mean, yeah, I guess so. I mean, and it made me wonder if some people are more that's a experience that's found in some people and not others, and they might be more susceptible, therefore, to getting sort of addicted to it.
Yeah, there probably are a bunch of different factors that increase things like susceptibility to that. And, you know, the interesting thing would be to look at that and see if you could figure out what makes somebody's susceptibility, what would make somebody more likely to experience that, to experience runner's high, the excessive exercising sort of reaction, whether it ties into susceptibility to other kinds of things like drug or alcohol use, right? Because then it might tell you something more about what we should be attending to when we're concerned about the behaviors, right? So in the stuff that I did back when I like 20 years ago, we were looking at susceptibility measures, right? And so we were particularly interested because there was a huge difference, like in terms of how likely women were to have disordered thoughts about their eating, even if they had the same kinds of exposure to things that we would consider to be risk factors, like high perceptions of female competition, um, the sort of high levels to media imagery or whatever, high levels of stress in other areas of their lives. Um, and one of the things that seemed to be somewhat protective was high levels of social support. So now we weren't actually, you know, we're measuring their perceptions of social support, right? So we don't really know about the social support. But when they feel like they have a lot of social support, whether it's from parents, lovers, or friends, that seems to serve some sort of protective effect against them actually engaging in behaviors that are disordered, whether their thinking about it is a little bit disordered or not. And so, from an intervention standpoint, I think that's probably one of the ways that we could try and tackle some of these problems better, because even so, say it is female competition, right? How do you remove that? Like it's part of our lives, right? It's like you can't wave a wand and take kids out of their 2000 student high school where they're competing with other people all the time, right? We don't live in the ancestral environment, we live in the modern world. And so what things can we change? And some of it might be the way people think about their social support, and to try and encourage, you know, closer social ties to people in a way that might be protective.
we live in the modern world with abundant calories, right? And also in a culture where thinness in women is prized in a particular way, in that you see lots of thin women on catwalks and so on. And there's a funny contradiction there, because the reason to be blunt, the reason that you see a lot of really skinny women on catwalks is partly because skinny women are good clothes horses, and partly because gay men are disproportionately found in fashion and are not as interested in like voluptuous curves, right? Which straight men are interested in. But it means that often women, these competitive teenage girls you're talking about, they will consider thinness to be very high status, even though thinness isn't actually sexually that attractive to. I mean, obviously there's like a sweet spot for body fat that, from the straight male perspective, which is a long way above the thin ideal. And yet either girls don't know that, or that's not actually what they care about. They're not actually, I mean, obviously for severe anorexia, it's got nothing to do with wanting to look sexy. I'm thinking more about the general thin ideal seems to be kind of disconnected from sexual attraction.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I'm sure you've seen the studies, right, where they ask men and women to rate the attractiveness of different pictures of women, and women find a thinner woman more attractive than the men do. Men prefer a slightly heavier standard of beauty. Um, and, and again, it's a much curvier standard of beauty. And so I think, I think the interesting question is how much of that is driven by, again, this idea that that maybe somewhat more I don't know. There's a number of different hypotheses for why women would have it driven to the thinner side. One could do with this competition thing. One could do with what they're exposed to. Although, again, I mean, I do agree that like we get to see runway models, but a lot of people's exposure to images is also of people who aren't as thin as runway models, right? That are the people in their own environment, but also like attractive women who are in film and TV that aren't as thin as the runway models from that perspective. So there's the issue about how much of it is that they really do think it's more attractive versus them thinking that it has more to do with them looking a higher status, right? And that this is what's driving status in women. And because it's kind of interesting, I read a study and it was kind of funny because it kind of touched on this issue about status competition in women. And it was one that was looking at like women's preference for expensive handbags, right? And women might think, well, it's important to look at it to have this handbag, but like men don't have a clue about handbags. They don't care
No.
unless they're having to buy one for their partner. And so for them it means nothing. But for women, this is something that's important to them somehow, or at least some of them in negotiating this, and they certainly know the difference between cheap and expensive. So I sometimes think that some of it may be just that there is it's something other than just attractiveness, and we may be calling it attractiveness, but women really what they mean is status, and that's why they're rating things differently. And some of it may just simply be that they have accepted this idea that thinner is always better in terms of attractiveness without paying attention to what men want, right? I mean, it's kind of funny because if you look at runway models and you look at porn stars, they don't look the same. And that should be the first clue that that's not what men necessarily want on average, because what men tend to spend their time looking at on average is a much curvier female figure, right? The whole waist hip ratio thing where, you know, you have wider hips and you have larger breasts and a tiny waist, right? So the waist is still
And a
small.
big round bum.
Yeah, yeah. And well, yeah, I mean, it just like you've got gluteal femoral body fat, and that's attractive to men.
I've read all this analysis of like the dimensions of sex dolls and
Yeah.
stuff, and what this tells us about. I mean, very interesting. Yeah, men like bums, it turns out. I mean, who knew? Obviously, like all men knew. I say this, like male listeners will
Right, right. In the grand scheme of things, right? That doesn't mean that some people
Yeah.
don't prefer a specific thing, but in the grand scheme of things, most men find a particular, which is why some women are, sort of universally seen as attractive, right?
Yeah, right. And it's just curious that women have not necessarily, well, women have cottoned on to a lot of it. Like we know that looking youthful is beautiful. We know that clear skin and big boobs is attractive and all of this. But yes, the thinness thing is really interesting. I mean, this question about whether it's a status signal, could it be because of abundant calories? To be thin in the modern world requires you to be very conscientious or something like that, and that is a proxy for some other kind of status signal, or could it be something like that, do you
Yeah,
think?
I think like a visual sign of it. Because if you think about historically, right, heavier was more attractive, but you had to have the time and the resources to consume that food, right, and not have to work it off. Whereas if you look at the modern environment, it's really easy to be fat, and it takes a lot more work and leisure time to actually be thin and fit, right? Like if you're going to spend an hour or two at the gym or doing whatever else you're doing to make yourself look attractive and eat less, that shows a bunch of things about you that are probably going to be linked to a higher social status, right? It's just easier to do it if you've got the time to do it and the resources to do it. Even when you think about it in terms of the modifications that people make to their body, right? When women modify their bodies, I mean, women may get lipo, but they get lipo and they put it somewhere else, right? It's like take the fat out of my stomach and put it in my butt, or put implants in. I mean, the majority of people are not making them. The majority of women are not making themselves look less feminine. They're trying to exaggerate their femininity.
Is it also youth? Younger women are slimmer? I mean, just the nature of it's like I've read all these studies about whether women get fat on the pill, and the answer is yes, but only because people just tend to get fat over time. And so if you're on the pill for a long time, chances are you'll get fatter. Like that's just kind of how it goes.
I think that so the other thing is as women age, yes, as everybody ages, there's a tendency to put on some weight. For women, as they get closer to menopause and they hit menopause, their body shape also changes a bit, right? The way they deposit fat changes because it's influenced by hormones. So women tend to have a little bit less feminine shape as they get older, even if they are fit. There's still a little bit of that that's happening. Um, and with successive pregnancies, right, often there's a weight gain that it may not always be lost unless you have the time and effort and resources to make the attempt to get rid of that, right? And there's like even some spreading of the hips, right, that happens just because of the bones and everything like shifting a little bit with pregnancy and having babies. That if you
And your
look at,
feet.
yeah, I have a friend, and she's a
Yeah.
great example of this because she is quite thin still. She's always been thin, but when she had babies, it's all like all of a sudden she had hips, and she never really had hips before. She was very boyish. And that never went away then afterwards, which I actually think was a benefit. I mean, I think it made her look more shapely in a way that I think was very attractive in terms of what men would like. Um, but she was a very boyish girl before.
But then I suppose you'd expect men to. I mean, I think what it is like men do like slimness. It's just not too much, and maybe women don't have an intuitive sense of what that exact sort of range of body fat percentage is really
Yeah,
ideal.
I mean, I really do think that men prefer, like, if you were looking at a big scale study, looking at male preferences for female shape and size, that men prefer something that is um, sort of what I would consider probably, well, I don't know whether it would be average size now, but what we would have used to think of as average size and fit. So like it's like toned, right? So like good skin condition, because those are things that are indicators of young, active, right? These are all things that are indicators of health and vitality, and that's going to be attractive, right? In a mate. I mean, women care about that when they're looking at male attractiveness as well. So I don't think it's surprising that that's something that would be considered attractive. I just think that the extremes are not considered attractive, generally speaking. So very thin is not attractive, very heavy is not attractive on the average. Something in between, right? Like it's something that it would be more close to what you might consider the average healthy young woman looks like is what men like.
All right, I think this brings us on to talking about porn. But should we start by talking about porn for women, i.e., generally non-visual porn? Well, I mean, so tell me about that. Women do watch porn, but actually they are more likely, is that right, to be drawn to like text-based?
Women certainly spend more time and money consuming non-visual erotic material, however you want to classify it, right? So if you think about this like in a more historical perspective, like over the last, I don't know, 50 years, whatever, romance novels, right, were one genre of erotic fiction for women. And they varied in how explicit they were, from things that, you might not be surprised to see your grandma reading, to, things that are pretty explicit. And that would be one form of erotic literature for women. Since then, I mean, you've also got a wide range of, things that are more explicit types of erotic literature for women. You have aspects of fan fiction, right, that are very explicit erotic genres for women. And there are some women who also consume pornography. There are definitely a lot less women consuming visual pornography than men. And some of that is a reflection, I think, of the fact that women may want to create their own visuals and may not want necessarily the others, or may not require the others. And that women also often, when you ask women about their sexual fantasies, they're often people they know, whether it's a previous partner, a current partner, a celebrity crush, whatever. Those are the things that they fantasize about. And so it makes sense that they would want all of this background information. And because they're so often interested in the relationship as well as the sex, I think that's a much easier thing to convey in written fiction than it is in at least the traditional way that pornography was presented, which is very little storyline, and two people encounter each other and have sex. Which, if you're doing it for masturbatory purposes and you're male, that's going to be very effective, but probably less so for females.
Tell me about the work you've done on androgen exposure in utero and female porn consumption.
Yeah, so and this is an area that I would like to do more work in, looking at sort of larger scale studies. I've done some small scale stuff looking at, in particular, the one study was looking at slash fans, and this was done quite a while ago now, before the rise of the huge volume of stuff that's available on the internet. But when people that were exchanging this material were doing it at sort of in-person conventions through the mail, things like that. Anyways, I was interested in trying to look at the question of whether women who preferred that type of fan fiction might be different in some way from women who don't prefer that, who wanted to read heterosexual stories versus these male homoerotic stories. And one of the hypotheses that I had was that they might be preferentially tomboys, that there was something about the nature of the action adventure, of the superhero, that kind of type of story, that was also appealing, and that those kind of men were also appealing to tomboys, who often tend to have very close male friends that they play with and interact with because they share these common interests. We measured the 2D40 finger digit ratio, which is there's a lot of debate about how accurate a measure it is, but it's sometimes considered to be a measure of prenatal testosterone exposure. And there are studies showing higher, or more masculine 2D40 ratios in girls that have had high levels of androgen exposure in utero, like girls that have CAH, for example. And so the question was,
or girls who have
congenital adrenal
or girls who have male twins. Is that also?
It can happen in those cases, but I was thinking about studies of girls that have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, so they have had a higher in utero exposure in a clinical sense. And there's a lot of research that's been done on them, looking at their sexual behavior, their occupational preferences, their toy preferences and stuff, showing it's shifted in the masculine direction. And so one question, and they do tend to get reported as being tomboys when they're little girls. And so based on that, we thought, well, maybe this would also be true for this group. And so I collected data from women who were consumers of slash fiction, of this kind of fast fan fiction. And they did, in fact, they did disproportionately report being considered tomboys when they were children, but also did tend to have this shifted slightly in the more masculine direction finger ratio. So it's suggestive. I mean, it was a relatively small population, And I wanted to collect the data in person because there's also a lot of debate in the field about how accurate doing things like photocopies and scans of people's hands are for doing these measurements. And if you do them in person, it's a lot. I felt more confident in the results. But ideally, you would see a larger sample replicating it. And actually, something more broad now that there's so much more online, it would be useful to recruit people to participate in those kinds of studies from this much larger base. And also maybe to do some cross cultural stuff on that, because of course, there's this whole genre of Japanese anime and manga that is read, that is male romance, that is read by young girls in Japan. And the question is, would that effect hold up there, or is there something different going on there? And so I think that there's opportunities for lots of future work looking into that more.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.